Okay. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
Hello. Good afternoon, everybody, all who joined us, and our guests. First, I will introduce myself. I'm Eran Mordechowicz. I'm the head of ICOMOS, the board of ICOMOS, since 4 years. And I would like first to thank for all the organizers for this conference, for organizing this international event, virtual international event, and bringing on board so many lectures and point of view about industrial heritage. And thank Tamar Tuchler from the Council for Conservation of Heritage Sites in Israel, and all the organizers, Nona Cohen, and ICOMOS Israel, Yael Peker, from the Committee for Industrial Heritage. So first I will introduce our guests. We have two guests in this final panel. I will ask Marie-Jo to introduce herself in a few words, please.
Yes, thank you, Eran. So I am the president of a French organization which is called Rempart, and which is managing with heritage since 57 years now. And the aim of our mission, yes, our work is to organize volunteer work camps on heritage. We are proving that with let's say the commitment of the civil society, we can also enhance heritage and rehabilitate it and safeguard it.
Okay, thank you. Michiel, you have introduced yourself a few minutes ago, so please say something.
Well, I'm still the same Michiel. So I was trained as an engineer and architect, and then first I worked as an urban designer. I'm passionate about cities and their real estate and their heritage, and then I became an alternative real estate developer. And we focus on complex adaptive reuse projects, and we try to develop these projects in the most participatory way as possible, not only allowing people to come up with ideas, but even allowing people to co-finance these projects through one of the other organizations I co-finance, which is called Stadsmakersfonds, which is a cooperative investment fund, especially for heritage buildings.
Okay. So I will start with you, Michiel. My first question is really interesting regarding the name. Miss Miyagi, tell something about it.
A long story. I used to work in Cape Town, and they used to have a Madame Zingara. It was a chain of very nice spaces like hotel, restaurant, bars, and there was always something local in the neighborhood. And I always liked this idea of this alter ego that improved the city as like a hero. And with Miss Miyagi, we are working in the real estate sector, which is sometimes very commercial and aggressive. And Mr. Miyagi is the coach of Karate Kid. He's learning Karate Kid to fight in a more ethical and a more beautiful but also more powerful way. And I think this is what we try to do with Miss Miyagi in the real estate world: is do things differently with a better result. And we also use her as an alter ego. So sometimes we have very strong opinions about things that are going wrong. And before, I always had to put my name under this statement, and it would get me into trouble. And now it's my boss, Miss Miyagi, who gets into trouble if she if she writes something very powerful. So yeah.
Good answer, Michiel. So as we have seen in your presentation, but also as I, with other experience visiting Leuven a few years ago, you also presented here. What would you say is the role of those projects of adaptive reuse, particularly the industrial one, in the regeneration of those urban areas? I mean, for the setting of those places, for people who don't know, it's in the former or present industrial area of Leuven, which is a not too big city, but it's still used to be industrial. So can you say something about the contribution of those projects to the generation?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because both projects are actually in quite a dense residential adaptive reuse project. And we see that traditional real estate developers are very much interested in breaking down buildings and building new residential buildings. But then by doing so, you don't really create interesting neighborhoods. So we do see that an adaptive reuse project of these iconic buildings actually does bring a huge amount of extra value in these neighborhoods. And it also creates an awareness both with politicians, but even with real estate developers who are not interested in doing these projects. They do understand that they need these projects to actually create interesting neighborhoods. So these projects are both catalysts in the development of the entire neighborhood.
Which brings me actually to my 4 questions. So I put it forward because it connects to what you said now. As you deal with investors and loaners, because as you explained in the lecture, you so and managed to convince people to loan money for those projects, for the social projects. Is it still, do you still need to convince them about the advantages of that heritage has in this kind of project?
No, everybody likes heritage, but they don't really like the fact that you can create a lower revenue from it. So it's not an easy task to convince people. We do find people. I mean, we've collected millions over years, and we see a growing awareness about people understanding that what they do with their money does affect their neighborhoods and the world around it. So definitely there's a shift going on with more and more awareness about heritage, which is good. Also, even studies have shown that even the value of real estate around heritage building increases because people do value. But the difficulty is just that these adaptive reuse projects, they are very complex. They are less profitable most of the time. They take much more time to prepare. So on average, it's at least 5, 6, 7 years. So the financial revenue is less, and that is the story that we try to convince people, is that maybe the financial revenue is less, but we are giving also other sorts of revenues, and we just try to convince people from another package deal, a package deal which is better for them and for their society and for their children. And people believe that, and once they are part of this story, and that's also why we are aiming also for a personal revenue. Like, we create buildings that are accessible, so people can go there, they can see what the effect is of their investments. Then you do create some kind of a wheel that keeps on rolling, and people start to get more and more convinced about this new package deal. Yeah. I think Eran, you lost you're muted. Maybe the
yes, and now I'm back online.
Oh.
Marie-Georges, talking about complexity that Michiel mentioned, there is a need for professionals to do the conservation works also on those kind of buildings. There are all kind of levels of professionality and sub professions within the conservation area. Since your organization is about also training professionals, also accessing the wide public, how do you what do you do in order to convince the new generations of people to work in this field of conservation and heritage?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually, because, you know, we noticed that every year we have around 4,500 volunteers coming, not only young people, but most of them, they are young. They are around 24, 25 years old. they are not so complicated to convince, because they are here with a goal, you know, and their goal is to be useful. We notice that, we know that, because they write it to us. They want to be useful. They like heritage and they want to be useful. So this is like 70% of the whole amount of volunteers coming, which are saying so. I can hear sometimes people saying, oh, you know, young people, they don't want to do, they want to do work. That's not true. That's wrong. You know, they are able to do, and they are easily convinced. Yes, they are easy to be convinced. Sorry for my English, and I am French. So, but some of them are already architects, for example, or students in architecture, or in history, or history of the arts, and so on. But most of them, they are nothing really in that field, you know. So we can show them a way to discover this sector of employment, which is very, very, let's say, I don't know if it's, we can say that in English, but it's intention, you know. We need people to work in historical buildings and so on, because we are lacking people in this field, very skilled people. So we try to convince them in that way to go to certain category of works, you know, of jobs, and which we are a lot of jobs to find in this way.
Can you estimate how many of these volunteers or people who come first to the camps that you organize finally find themselves into the market as conservation workers?
Yes, I don't want to be like, you know, too proud about that, but let's say that if every year we have around 50%, only 50%, you know, like 1% of those the total amount going to this field, we are just Rempart, you know. We are not a school, we are not an institution like for that. So it's well be done. Yes.
Okay, thanks. Michiel, I come back to you and the question of the image of industrial relics. The evolution of industrial heritage, and I think it's reflected well on the urban context of buildings, the areas they go through, they move from being centers of production, actually of wealth, although the workers themselves not always were wealthy, maybe they were even poor, and maybe there are also some kind of memories of the workers, not only of the entrepreneurs. Then it moved to be neglected urban areas. Always we have these pictures of neglected and rundown buildings. And then afterwards, what you are doing actually is returning them to be sort of social factory. So my question is, what is left in those buildings and in those projects and initiatives that you do from all this multi-layered history? How do you physically leave marks of this kind of a cycle of life of the buildings and areas?
Difficult question. Maybe
Sorry.
What I find interesting, sometimes we have a discussion, is that if you reintegrate heritage in urban developments that we see, especially in Europe, that it's a lot of time it's about consumption of heritage. It's about consumption of culture. So these elements are there and people like them and they want to look at them. What we actively try to do is that most of the projects we do are non-residential, and most of these projects have programs who actually produce something. They rather are more interested in producing new culture in old buildings and consuming the culture of that old building in the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And this is, I think this is a very important discussion, is that the city is a breeding ground for all kinds of activities, social activities, cultural production. And once architecture or real estate development becomes a pure financial commodity, then we get into a competition where most of the times, especially these programs where things are produced which are more complex, they actually lose out in this competition. And that's one of the reasons why we are focusing so much on non-residential programs, because residential is a lot more easier. It creates more money, and in the competition, it always wins. I don't know if that's kind of an answer to your question.
Yeah, I was kind of fascinated by the notion that those buildings, after being elected, the first productive machine, and then being neglected, and then they become sort of a hub for new production. So, example, when we visited the Horn, it's a place where people work and they produce and they create new things in this kind of a historical environment where other things were produced in the past, but now their production in is fitting the new society. So it's a kind of a new layer, which is, you know, in heritage we say that keeping the original use is sort of a kind of a important rule or element in heritage conservation. But of course, those kind of buildings and areas cannot be made to brewery again, or have this heavy industry, let's say, but it needs to produce something new. And therefore, I was fascinated with the idea of this cycle that you bring a new layer.
Well, I think it's, yeah, maybe if I can add to that, it's one of the reasons why I changed jobs, in the sense that as an urban designer or as an architect, my responsibility was more towards the shape or the building, and I had no control on the program. It was always the client who was actually defining the program. And it was exactly for this reason that I felt like, if we want to create livable cities, if we want to activate those adaptive reuse projects, I need to get in control of the program. And that's why I switched from being an architect towards a real estate developer. So I totally agree with what you say.
Maybe kind of to start to sum up or to conclude, I'm going to challenge you again. So if you need to give 3 golden advices for to convince investors and decision makers to go for adaptive reuse, and I think I have in mind the Israeli context that is less kind of yet it is less at the moment open to this kind of adaptive reuse of industrial heritage. So what would be the kind of the 3 most important advices that you would say why to go for adaptive reuse of industrial buildings?
Is it to me or to Marie, or?
It's to you. Marie, you
Yeah,
can join up with.
Yeah. Maybe, well, easy thing is CO2. Embodied energies in buildings becoming more and more important. And very important is that, I mean, we can insulate a lot of buildings, but even insulating buildings will, in the short run, create new embodied energies, which will only be gained back by 2050. And the urgency is now. So any embodied energy that you can keep is a way to go. So that is definitely on the main agenda of Europe nowadays in adaptive real estate. Secondly, for me, is that if you use heritage, you can reactivate a lot of non-tangible values in terms of cultural identity in the neighborhoods, social whatever awareness. So basically you are actually winning. I mean you could almost say you have to spend less money on cultural organizations, social organizations, a lot of other budgets that you can spend less on them if you do adaptive reuse right, because you can reactivate values who are in the building already there. So it's almost as if you would say, if you invest in like sustainable mobility, maybe the budget shouldn't come from mobility, maybe it should come from the health department, because you're actually gaining health. It's almost the same. I think thirdly,
And the third one?
The third for me is that we are living in turbulent times, and we need to create resilient cities. And by breaking down stuff and building new stuff with the things we believe in now, it's already outdated once it's gone. So reusing buildings and makes you creative. It makes you build other things than what you would build normally, and it does create diversity and resilience in your city. And I think that's a very important, as a city maker, as something very important to understand. I mean, there's a simple say that says, heritage is proven sustainability. Whatever is there for 500 years is the only thing which has been proven. Like we talk a lot about sustainability, but I wonder what percentage. Sorry. Whoa. Do you hear that?
We have to.
Okay. So all I'm saying is, like, I wonder, like, to what percentage of the things that we find sustainable now in 100 years times, we will still think is sustainable. Now, every heritage building is still standing there is 100% sustainable then and now.
Okay. Thank you very much.
This was my presentation.
I have to finish.
That was really clear and inspiring.
Bye-bye.
To maybe see you one day in real life.
I want to thank you. I think you did a wonderful job. Since the beginning, since from the